so much for coming. This is the last seminar in our Indigenous Science seminar series this year, and I'm really excited for this conversation that we're going to be having today. I just have a couple of announcements before I turn things over to Eric Simon, who's going to be our moderator. First of all, we are going to be recording this seminar, so if you have any issues with your voice being on the recording, either don't speak or come and talk to me, and we can possibly edit it out if you say something that you don't want. But please let me know by tomorrow if you don't want to be recorded, otherwise we'll assume that it's recorded. We're going to try to wrap this conversation up by 2:30 or so, but afterwards you're all welcome to stay, enjoy the coffee, snacks, and continue the conversations here in this room or upstairs in the lounge, in the anthropology lounge. We have that booked for a while after the seminar. So I'll just turn it over to Eric, and thank you again for coming.
Hi, thank you everyone. As Jess said, this is our fourth seminar in that series that began in the summer under the auspices of the Indigenous Science Research Cluster here at UBC. A series that will probably continue certainly in the new year. We will announce the next one soon. These things tend to be quite informal, so I have a very small set of framing questions that we'll discuss briefly, and then turn it over to the room for discussion. So, brief introduction. Karen Thomas is from the Tsleil-Waututh Nation in North Vancouver, with family ties to Teniami and the Squamish Nations. She discovered archaeology through a series of fortuitous events, and I hope to tell some more about this. And she's very pleased to have led her here to her Master's in Anthropology at UBC. I will say as an aside, we have the pleasure of studying Karen's work at SAQ and at UBC.
Eric was my TA. For Georgia's class.
It's a little bit of nepotism on this panel.
I wasn't going to follow that.
I'll throw it to the end. Julie Cruikshank, well, easy introduction here, I'm sure, without doing that anyway. She's Professor Emerita at UBC's Department of Anthropology. Probably best known for her work with the Yukon Athabascan and Tlingit elders, who she spent many years with collaborating to record their oral traditions. Her interests include the relationships between oral knowledge and societal struggles for legitimacy, the anthropology of memory, and the intersection of Indigenous oral traditions and the environmental sciences. I know we have some good scientists here, so we have an interesting conversation. And finally, George Nicholas is visiting out with a friend of archaeology, at SFU, far distant lands of Burnaby. From 2008 to 2016, he directed an international research initiative, Intellectual Property Issues and Cultural Heritage, or IPINCH. And previously, from 1991 to 2005, George developed and directed SFU's Indigenous archaeology program on the Kamloops Indian Reserve. He's a voice in the field of Indigenous archaeology and archaeological ethics, and many other things I could go on, but I won't because I'm going to to the panel to introduce themselves at more length. And so I guess what we're wanting to hear initially is a bit of your background, your research interests and experience, and how those have interfaced or interacted with the confluence of Indigenous and Western understanding.
Do I have to go first? No? Oh, okay, I'll get it over. First, I would just like to say that I am super awed to be on a panel with these folks over here. I found archaeology fortuitously in 2011 when my nation was looking for field technicians to participate in a collaborative research project for the South Fraser Perimeter Road that impacted two major archaeological sites on the shores of the Fraser River, the Glenrose and St. Mungo Cannery sites. And it was just, they needed a person, and I was working at Starbucks, and I was like, okay, I'll try this out, it's great. And so I got there and I never wanted to leave, and then I applied and was accepted to university at SFU, and everything just spiraled out of control. And here I am. But my undergrad thesis, I looked at surface collecting behaviors of people from my nation on the shores of Burrard Inlet who collect artifacts and treasure them and curate them in interesting ways. And I was motivated to look at that because I was frustrated by the way archaeologists prioritize the data over the objects, and like people were almost hurt by archaeologists being like, "Yo, it's a lovely projectile, but there's no context." And I really wanted to show that context isn't everything, and I wanted to offer community members an opportunity to talk about why they love collecting things and what it means to them and the connection to the ancestors through that. And I'm hoping that my research here continues to disrupt these assumptions and dialogues that archaeology sort of has with descent communities. And I want to look at the continuity of ritual through the ochre use. Ochre is a mineral pigment that's used for many things, and I would like to talk to descent communities about the ritual properties of ochre and to determine if there are different kinds of ochre for different things, and then combine that with a geochemical analysis of ochre samples from archaeological sites previously excavated to determine if those ritual properties can be mapped onto the past. And if I can see, well, ochre A is over here and ochre B is over there, and maybe I can speculate on the activities at those sites. We'll see. I haven't started my research yet. I'm just working on my coursework, so my future is yet to be told.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be here with this wonderful panel, and both Eric and Karen as former students, and Julie is someone I've always looked up to. I'm sort of in this accidentally. I decided I was going to be an archaeologist when I was 8 years old, and I pursued that. My interest in archaeology, my direction in archaeology was always science-based. And at the University of Massachusetts, where I did my doctorate, my focus was on early post-glacial land use and a very, as it would be called, processual orientation of trying to look at human behavior as a way to generalize both about the past and use the past to generalize about human behavior today. And it was the direction I was probably going to head in until my wife accepted a job in British Columbia. We decided whichever one of us got our PhD first and got the best job we would take. So I ended up in Kamloops, British Columbia, and SFU had just started a campus on the reserve. And I went over, and teaching as a sessional one semester led to 16 years there and 10-year promotion and so on. In 2005, I moved down to the main SFU campus. But for 30 years, as a result of that fortuitous accident, I've been working with and for Indigenous peoples in British Columbia, but also around the world. And my orientation has been to teach archaeology, especially in Kamloops, but to teach it to Indigenous peoples to use as they see fit, to use as a tool to address their own questions and so on. But I have also been involved, as Eric mentioned, with directing the iPinch project. And this was an international collective designed to identify and to address outstanding or future issues about cultural appropriation and research ethics and much more. So in the course of those two realms, I became more and more interested in or drawn to non-Western ways of knowing the world. And this has sometimes been a very uncomfortable place to be, that is caught between different ways of knowing, different cultures, different values, and so on. But I've always sort of been optimistic about such discomfort because it forces you into action. You cannot be complacent. And so I see this as a rich opportunity to learn, to engage, and to wrestle with really big problems in terms of different modes of knowledge, issues of truth and objectivity, and verification, and cross-cultural understandings, and many of the topics that I think we've got the opportunity to discuss here in today's panel.
Well, like both Karen and George, I think I ended up accidentally doing the kind of work I've been doing much of my life. I had an undergraduate degree in anthropology many years ago, and then I had a chance to go to the Yukon Territory. I spent time in Alaska on the way, and I got very involved in how the land claims agreements were being negotiated then. They went forward in 1971. So when I was in the Yukon, this was very much what people were interested in doing. And my friends were young women my own age. We were all in our early 20s at that point. And I was very interested in whether there was some way an outsider could contribute to all of this. And they said, you know, one thing you could do, they stressed very strongly, they felt their role was a political one. They wanted to get more and more involved in the negotiations, which they felt were being carried on rather too much by men. And they argued that if I could do some life histories with mothers, this might be a way to get at some of the issues that were important for women related to land claims. So they introduced me to grandmothers who I was delighted to find were really interested in working on a project like this. And we produced the booklets. First of all, there were about 10 different ones. We produced little booklets for communities and for families to do with what they wanted. The Yukon Native Brotherhood at that point was very helpful. They provided some duplication resources for us. There were no photocopy machines in those days, so we had Gestetners working to make these booklets. And this project went on for a couple of years, certainly with support from the beginning of these nation organizations. And then at that point, 3 of the women in particular, who were senior women, Mrs. Annie Ned, Mrs. Kitty Smith, and Mrs. Angela Sidney, decided they didn't want to stop. They wanted to keep doing this. And as Mrs. Ned used to say, I want my works to go outside, with a capital O, meaning outside the Yukon, talking about the importance of the kinds of things that we know. So I was interested in this notion of life histories, and I would begin with the idea of, can you talk a little bit about the time you were a child, shortly after the gold rush in most cases? And they say, oh, that's fine, dear, but write down the story of the boy who stayed with fish. And so I do it exactly as they wanted, and we tried to move back. And no, write down the story of the man who stayed with gopher, or the woman who married the bear. And it became clear that there was a real literature, oral literature there that they felt needed to be known, particularly by young people in the communities. Particularly young women in their case, and so we continued that for quite a number of years. So that was the first surprise to me in that project, was that life history, they'd say, this is life history, these are the things people need to know, and they did come back to talk about life histories, but the narratives were the important part. But the second puzzle, and this is where scientists would be interested, I think, was they had a lot of stories about glaciers. Glaciers, this puzzled me because none of them lived anywhere near glaciers. I knew that they were all living much further east. And I later learned that the reason this had happened was because when the Alaska Highway went through in 1942, the park was created and Indigenous people were moved out of the park. They were not allowed to hunt there anymore. So they did know about glaciers and they heard about them. But these glaciers weren't the glaciers that I had understood. They weren't glaciers that stayed still. They were glaciers that would sit for a while and then they would move, sometimes for several kilometers, cross rivers, create lakes. And it was this tremendously dynamic relationship. And so that's when I became interested in this notion of oral tradition in science. And I actually went away for a while and did a little program on the history, on circumpolar oral histories and relationships between science and other disciplines. And had an opportunity to make contacts with glaciologists in this part of the world. And what I learned was that these stories about glaciers and move were not just stories that people had heard, they actually had. They were, glaciologists say that in the Antarctic, in Iceland, and in Greenland, and in the northern part of the Yukon, there are glaciers that will sit for years and years and years, and then suddenly they can move quite some distance, some kilometers, and that there have been lakes that built up and then erupted. And so this is a very vibrant kind of landscape that I was hearing about. And so that's, I began to read more and more about traditional knowledge and oral traditions and get interested in that. Maybe we can carry on with some of those questions. I want to just make one more point, though. I think that the first time I went to a meeting that was rather like this was in Haines Junction in 1982, and I remember it included a number of people. There were students from the college, there were scientists, there were others who were all talking about exchanging information between communities and scientists and historians. And Mrs. Ned, one of the women I've been working with for quite a while, stood up in the middle of the afternoon and she said, "Where do you people come from?" And she said, "You people talk from paper." And she said, "I want to talk from Grandpa," and began to tell stories about, again, the relationships of humans and animals that were very important in that area. So it's my interest, I think, in this is giving oral tradition the prominence that it really deserves in any of these discussions, rather than seeing as oral tradition something you can take nuggets from and maybe build some sort of a theoretical framework.
Yeah, and that's a great segue into the next sort of framing question we want to discuss is, I guess, just unpacking the title of both the seminar and I suppose our cluster as well, as much as ultimate science. And the title we used for this seminar was Converging or Contradictory Ways of Knowing the Scientific Nature of Traditional Knowledge, and implicitly signaling that there was I guess the question you put with is there a distinction between the two ways of knowing? Are these useful concepts to frame with? And I think we can start by unpacking some terminology. We use traditional knowledge in our title. I tend to use indigenous knowledge more broadly. George, you refer to non-Western ways of knowing, and Julie, I know you speak of local knowledge, more than indigenous knowledge. So different ways of framing things, similar overlapping sets of ideas. What does signal by use the terms we use, perhaps, as a starting point?
There are different ways of knowing, and often we refer to, people know the world either through science or through religion, which is a gross oversimplification and one that really doesn't do anyone justice. There's also the discussion, and very pertinent here, in terms of Western science versus traditional knowledge, or traditional ecological knowledge, or indigenous knowledge, or indigenous science. And science is science, knowledge is knowledge, whether we call it local, whether we call it Western or indigenous. But at the same time, we need to sometimes put in those qualifiers in discussions like this, where we're trying to compare and contrast how they don't fit, or how they disagree. I mean, if we look at science as a way of knowing the world through observation and experiment, which is the classic Western in a nutshell definition, that's not all that different from how indigenous peoples engage with the world, because it is also through observation, through experiment, and doing something, and you don't get the outcome that you expect. But you also have enfolded into that other bodies of knowledge in terms of what would be referred to as oral histories, or as worldview, or whatever that additional layer is. Now, it's interesting that Western scientists today are often now promoting this notion of a more holistic science, a multi-layered science, which in a way replicates so-called indigenous science. So it is often a somewhat frustrating point where you're trying to compare and contrast indigenous versus Western ways of knowing, and happen to use that qualifier.
Well, if I just continue with one of those examples, that say the glaciology example, what really interested me was those women had very clear experiences with glaciers, surging glaciers, but they talked about them in very different ways from scientists. And scientists were very interested in talking with Mrs. Nibbs. She thoroughly enjoyed that. She liked talking with them, but she also thought they needed to learn quite a bit. But the stories that she told about these surging glaciers were that people had to be, just as you were in the stories about humans and relationships with animals, you had to be very, very respectful of the glaciers when you were in their range and near them. And that doing something, she said, they all said, the worst thing you can do is cook with grease anywhere near a glacier. Cooking fat, but cooking with grease, I think, if I know, people meant the kind of lard that you get that can be made from, say, moose grease. It's very, very good for cooking. But if you were in territory of glaciers, they said this was very dangerous to do because it would incite the glacier. And it seemed to be so much like the other stories. In fact, if you were the stories that they had told about animals, anything to do with making fun of or making jokes about or anything is seen as really, really wrong. And likewise, with these lumps of lard, if you cook it in a pan, it's sort of like a surging glacier. It sits there and then it starts to move very rapidly, and it could be seen as and interpreted as mimicking the glacier. And they told story after story of how these glacier surges happened when somebody was being disrespectful in that way. And it's interesting. I have friends my own age in the community now, and I was there's a young glaciologist who was working in the Yukon this summer, and she talked about discovering another surging glacier and going down to talk with some friends of hers at Chandler First Nation. One of the women said to her, "So what are you going to name it? You've got to find the name in our language for who's been cooking up there with grease, or who are people cooking it up there," or something like that. To make that point that scientists just don't know everything about this, that there are deep fundamental ways, as always, with relating to the environment that one lives in and everything about that environment. So.
I think that, when we think about these intersections between science and traditional knowledge, like a lot of people who don't work with Indigenous communities, they look to science to legitimize traditional knowledge, and they approach it from that perspective. And I think that the relationship should be more about collaborating, like corroborating both sources as legitimate. And it's ironic that I'm using these words. I don't know. It's a different topic, but I'll admit that when I came to archaeology, I was really, I absorbed the science, and I was like, great, well, the science can tell me everything. And I think that comes from being like an urban Indigenous youth who grew up in the city and sort of somewhat removed from the community, and not knowing a lot of that traditional knowledge. I was like, the science will have all of the answers. And a friend of mine called me a Binford-loving processualist before I knew what that meant. And now I realize that I was just sort of floundering for the legitimate science. I wanted all of the answers, and like the further I go in my education, I realize that not all of those answers are within the science. And I think that like critically examining why we prioritize the science is interesting. And I think a lot about the hierarchy of the senses and how it sort of skews our perceptions of reality. Like, why do we prioritize the things we see, right? So I saw it with my own eyes. And turns a phrase like that is, it's like nobody says, well, I smelt the truth, you know? And I think that like a good jumping off point is starting with even just the senses and why we prioritize our interpretation of reality.
To come back to the question about congruence versus contradiction. So over the last 5 or 6 years, I've been exploring, these two realms in the sense of looking at examples where there is apparent congruence or agreement between oral histories and archaeology. And there are more and more cases that have been identified as such. The eruption of Mount Mazama is recorded in Klamath stories. There's a recent study in Australia that identified 21 communities with stories about coastal inundation that speaks to the separation of New Guinea and Tasmania from the Australian mainland. There's work by Dana Lepofsky and others with clam gardens in BC. And I could give you 20 or 30 examples of this. And when we identify such examples, everyone seems to be happy that Indigenous peoples feel that their knowledge is validated, although it never needs to be validated by science. That's another conversation. And scientists are saying we have now additional proof, or we're also working with Indigenous peoples and we've got a nice collaboration. But what I've noticed is that whether in archaeology, whether in climatology or other fields, that so-called Western scientists turn to and acknowledge Indigenous knowledge when it tends to agree with their expectations. And otherwise, they don't acknowledge it or they even dismiss it. So there's a really interesting tension here that's been playing out. At the same time, there are examples where there is not apparent congruence between oral histories and archaeology. Does this mean that those stories are wrong? Well, not necessarily, because not all human behaviors leave a material record and so on. But It's not a black and white, it's not an easy kind of differentiation, because sometimes those apparent congruences may be just that, they may be apparent. And it's a much more complicated story that is, yet to be teased apart. And this also, brings forward the point about, many do dismiss so-called indigenous science for a variety of reasons, without acknowledging that there's often lack of congruence within Western science. When you look at, examples where science doesn't play out as it's supposed to. The famous cold fusion experiment has never been replicated. Or every few years you have a reversal in science-based medical advice in terms of alcohol is good or bad for you, salt is good or bad for you, eggs, butter, and so on. And no one seems to pick up on the fact that you have these apparent contradictions within science in much the same way there may be these apparent contradictions when we look at, or outsiders look at, indigenous knowledge.
I'm just wondering, one thing that as you're talking, I'm thinking, many of you are archaeologists working in British Columbia, and when I read archaeology works from British Columbia, I see like depth of history in a way that you aren't going to find in a place like the Yukon with the people who had to travel all the time, who didn't have permanent settlements. I saw Daniel Hosky's video just the other day, and I thought it was excellent about Bella Bella. But he's talking about how for thousands of years we've been able to look at the scene, our ancestors were able to look at it as well. In the Yukon, people had to move from different places, from winter to certain places, to fishing grounds in the spring and summer, to other places, so there was constant movement. So you're less likely to, archaeologists would say, you can find material records that replicate this. And one of the, I'll just mention this because I think it's an amazing collection. Many of you may know this book about Caudigan Sinchi, who was a man who was melting out of a glacier in British Columbia in 1999. Some hunters found him and immediately contacted the First Nation and the territorial governments, and they immediately got together to build a joint collaborative project about how to understand the remains of this man, what happened to him, where he was, how young he was, when he was born, all these kinds of things. And that project has gone tremendously well in some ways over a period of 20 years. This was only released 19 years later, this volume, 2018, sorry, which has as many articles by First Nation members of the community as it has by scientists, and they're all really, really good. But it's still complicated in a way that is different from if you had tremendous material, say a clam bed that had been there for hundreds of years or whatever. And I think that makes that a little bit trickier in this kind of situation.
It relates in the sense that you want to get at it, what your grandmothers. One of the things that strikes me when I think about indigenous knowledge is this notion of situated knowledge, of knowledge being where does it live or where does it sit, and is it in places, in landscape, in people. Talk about that, obviously implications for our practice. Maybe that's my next question to agree with this. What those aspects of indigenous knowledge, those are indigenous knowledge, what implications does it have for those of us who are research in indigenous communities?
I could just say one thing I think that has been, again, I'm speaking very much from local knowledge of one part of the world in Canada, but the placing projects there have been tremendously important. And that's where people, there are names for places, and those places have names, and those names have stories. And that's a very strong way of documenting history in a way that doesn't involve archaeology. But it does maybe give guidance to a whole lot of things about environmental management.
One of the challenges to the local knowledge is that sometimes it's not anyone else's business except for the communities, or certain groups or families or clans within that community. So outside researchers are coming in with the attitude that all knowledge is ours, or should be ours, and they come up against this response of, well, no, it's not yours, and in fact, it's not even shared amongst others in the community. And that's the case in Aboriginal Australia, for example. If you look at Australia, it's a wonderful case where basically the entire continent has been populated for 60,000 or so years. And basically every place has a name to it. And yet even within Aboriginal communities, there's secret sacred knowledge that is a wealth of information about past or present animal behavior or populations, movements, and so on. And it's restricted to very few people within that community, initiated people, for example.
That speaks to a thing that I've struggled with as an Indigenous student in anthropology and in archaeology is that private information and like the ethnographic era and the collection of knowledges before Indigenous communities realized what they would be used for, and the things that we can find in old ethnographies that today's communities are maybe uncomfortable with, like the accessibility. And I worked a lot with Treaty Lands and Resources, the department at my nation, about information sharing. And they work hard to put a Tsleil-Waututh face back on the land, but there's also a lot of stuff that they don't want to share. So it's like a dance that each community does with how much they want to share about use and occupancy versus like making sure that our presence is heard and felt, I think.
Well, I mean, the segues into anticipates the next, the final sort of framing question, which is about implications for practice. And I think, broadly speaking, as people who all have experience working at the intersection of the communal and Indigenous and different kinds of scientific approaches, what advice do you have for researchers working in Indigenous communities who are concerned with all these issues, situated knowledge, knowledge sharing protocols, these kinds of things, good relationships, doing good work?
In the area where I've worked, at least, it's really important to be able to, I'm going to have to stop for a second here, just how to frame this. It's really important to be able to know how to, who should be giving authority. Now, sometimes First Nations say that the First Nations should be giving authority to people who are working. And I know that in some cases in the communities, individuals feel that they should be able to work with other people as well. So that becomes a different kind of story, and it's one that changes over time, I think. It's, as far as I'm concerned, it's being able to work with people who they tell you what they want from this, what they want, what they expect, and you are able to provide that, because so much of what we learn, I think, really has to be validated by those people, the speakers. Certainly, the women I work with had a very clear idea of what they wanted done with their work, and they told me what to do, and I did it. And that's been interesting because I'm still very much in contact with all of them. We talk about this regularly.
And for my part, I'm grounded in Western science, and yet I respect and am informed by other ways of knowing, and I'm that much richer for it. But I'm also aware of the responsibilities that come with such knowledge, and I've been told certain things and shown certain things that I will not share with others. And this reminds me of my colleague Larry Zimmerman, who says there's really two approaches that we really should be promoting. One is continental archaeology, in which it's based on collaboration. It's based on respect and benefit sharing and power sharing. And that's something that I've long been promoting for a long time. But there's also something I think is equally important, and that is what he termed ethnocritical archaeology, which is based on acknowledging cultural differences and negotiating interpretations where there are different points of view. So I think both of those are really worthy avenues to pursue. But the big challenge that I see is the larger public attitudes about traditional knowledge. I mean, there are some harsh critics of traditional knowledge. Ronald Mason in archaeology has dismissed it as being unreliable or tainted by the colonial experience, amongst other sins. David Henge has questioned the reliability of being able to prove what is unprovable in terms of oral histories. And that is a really widespread attitude, I think, beyond the select group, including, I think, many in this crowd, who see value in these other ways of knowing. And just to give you another example of this in terms of public attitude. So in February, I wrote a piece for The Conversation on traditional knowledge and science, and pointing out here are various examples of convergence and examples of contradiction. And yet, we have an opportunity here to make science better by acknowledging, by being aware of these other perspectives, because it increases objectivity by challenging the homogeneous nature of science, and it gives us alternate working hypotheses. And I had a really positive, feedback on this overall. But there were a series of folks who were heavily critical of this piece because it had been picked up by the Smithsonian and other publications that had viewers' comments, as an option. And I was accused of, let me just read you a few of these responses. This is from the Smithsonian. I think the Smithsonian should not have published such an extreme postmodernist and anti-science article. Or this was an astoundingly bad article that a good science editor should have blocked. Or without the unnecessary anti-science, it would have been a good article. Or the Smithsonian has gone new age and anti-science and regressive. Now the point is that there is nothing in that piece that is anti-science. I'm simply saying here's a complementary approach that can bolster science or archaeological interpretations, or that may not agree with scientific explanations. And just to throw in one last point about this, I checked the view log of this piece this morning, and it is 200 short of 250,000 views at this point. So after you get out, go look up this article in the conversation, and you may be the one who trips that marker, and you win something. I don't know.
Yeah, I can't wait until people write angry comments on the article. I aspire to that greatness. I think that one thing I would like people who intend to do research with Indigenous communities to take away from this discussion is the importance of community-generated research questions, which is a thing that I have grappled with while doing this, because this ochre research question that I plan to do for my master's research it's my question. And the people who are excited about it are other archaeologists. And I know that there are people from my own communities or communities that I have ties to who believe that I maybe shouldn't be talking about this, or I can do this research, but can I publish about it? And part of me really wants to be of more service to my community and find out what they want to know. And some of the most successful projects that I've seen have been like the field schools ran in partnership with SFU and Tsleil-Waututh Nation, where they've gone to the archaeologists and said, what is it that you want to know? And then we identify a couple of questions, and then they have free labor of undergrads doing archaeology and answering these questions that are important to the community. So I think that is the biggest point that I would hammer home. The community relationships are paramount.
I have some more follow-up questions, but I think in the interest of time, I'd rather throw this to you. Yeah, please. I'll say the acoustics are not great in this room, so especially if you're speaking for this room, you can speak up. Yeah, please.
Hi, thank you for all your wonderful conversation and contribution. A lot of thoughts are running through my head. I'm thinking historically at the implication of the project here, Indigenous science, and how the notion, the concept of colonialism hasn't come up as frequently as I thought it would, because that goes back to the root of why we feel validated. Local knowledge feels validated when it finds the resonance in science, or that power dynamic implied under holistic of where to center, we need to add the margin now. And I wonder, because Eric, you brought up the term situated. It seems to me that the anti-science critic that you got were reacting because you, in a way, they don't want to see science situated. They want to see science as transcendental and everything else situated. When in fact the history of science excavates so much of the politics of why certain knowledge are pushed forward, and then those political implications are then withdrawn, and we assume, of course, air has pressure. When in fact that goes all the way back to the English Restoration, when they wanted to disseminate a form of knowledge that invalidated corporeal bodies. And I guess these thoughts come to my head, and I wonder, you must have come across these issues in your own work, whether that sheds light on the history of science and how it's this form of, we say Western knowledge production, but it's really also a colonial method of knowledge production. I'm curious your thoughts on around ideas like that.
I mean, the topic of colonialism is often the elephant in the room. Anthropology and to a degree archaeology have long been termed the handmaiden of colonialism. And there's a deep history that goes with the darker side of the earlier period of archaeological and anthropological development. That indigenous peoples were not long for this world, and therefore we should. It's our duty to collect whatever knowledge for the benefit of humanity. And that has fortunately been challenged, the latter part of the 20th century, and I think that these disciplines have learned their lessons to a degree. But it also speaks to the issue of science. How objective is science? And when we start to tease apart science, we see that it is not all that objective, and that there's opportunities to challenge it, as Alison Wiley has, for example, in terms of feminist archaeology, and a great article, Good Science, Bad Science, Science as Usual, where she does bring forward how feminist theory and practice can make science more homogeneous, more objective as a result. So these are issues that we continue to grapple with in our respective efforts to deal with the power differential, to deal with the notion that indigenous heritage is not public domain, free for the taking, that indigenous peoples are very concerned about how their heritage, whether derived from archaeology, anthropology, or other means, has been used to the benefit of others, but not to the community, nor does the community necessarily have any say in how that information has been used. So, a very good question, but very challenging to fully answer.
Thank you guys so much. I have enormous respect for the panel. As sometimes I say it to your face, sometimes I say it through joking and things like that. But you know that I have mad respect for everybody at the table. And I want to hold this banner high that you're raising right now about different ways of knowing, and I think one of the most important things, certainly in my experience as well, about trying to change the way science is framed and science is looked at, is by fundamentally defining what science is, right? And science is strictly a method. It's a method to get at knowledge, and that's it. It's just a method. And I think the way that we put, again, like this quote, science as an entity or as an experience on a pedestal is fundamentally wrong and is creating all of these problems which is why we have to have discussions like this. Because part of the method of science is understanding where your biases are coming from and identifying where your biases are. And that is far too frequently omitted from the methodology of science. And it's entirely problematic. And just from that perspective, like just defining, like very strictly defining that science is nothing but a method of discovery, how do we then go about sort of breaking down this hierarchical or this pedestal that we tend to put science on? Because if you're saying the science is fundamentally flawed, absolutely, because the scientists are not controlling their biases, and one of their biases is not considering alternative ways of knowing, and that this is just one way knowledge is produced, and oftentimes it's produced incorrectly because it's created by the data that's inputted. And then once new data is inputted, that result changes, right? Because it is a method with constructs. So how can you help those of us who are trying to teach, again, this quote, science to other anthropologists or other archaeologists, just walking around like challenging the idea that people have about what science is, to help sort of open up their minds to this knowledge that it is not the be-all and end-all of knowledge. It is a fundamental flaw that, again, because science is also part of that colonial framework, right? Science is a colonial construction as well. So how do we, help me finish my sentence. How do we
You're doing great.
help me off this pedestal that I put myself on. What's some advice to help shattering those frameworks and those ideas?
Why are you looking at me, Heather?
Because I love you, that's why.
Well, I mean, having just spent the better part of the last year writing the endless paper on decolonizing anthropology, I think that giving every scientist an understanding of the colonial structure and acknowledging the power relations and the inherent imbalances, settler colonialism, and the implications for Indigenous people in the 21st century, I think that is a starting off point, right? So we know science is not superior, but it's reproduced through practice. That's all we're offered, right? And I think that highlighting the time depth of Indigenous occupation of North America, 10,000 years of Indigenous knowledge, is that not science? I'm not the first person to say that, but it's long-standing. I'm not sure if that's helpful.
Absolutely.
But I think that examining the power relationships and giving everyone an understanding, no one is going to listen, giving everyone an understanding of the structure of settler colonialism is the best place to explain that science is not God, for lack of a better phrase. I'll get off there.
I've never actually thought about it as doing science. It was much more, we were talking about science as oral tradition, and or not so much oral tradition, but local knowledge, and I just have been very interested in following those kinds of trajectories. And I've always found it really interesting, as have the women I've worked with, talking to scientists, because I think sometimes they're not quite as narrowly framed as we may frame them in this context. That's just...
You raise a host of questions, Heather, and I think they're really well and deservedly, they're well framed and deservedly stated. One way to approach this is simply have a discussion about what is science, divorced from, the Indigenous issue, as it were. To point out that it is a process, it is a way of knowing, and that it is also a human project. And anything human is, of course, embedded with, our particular foibles and biases and so on. I could bring in a self-color chart, which is a way to standardize color, and I would not just give one reading on, what color this is, 10YR, 4/5, because people, have somewhat different physiological or interpretive ways of recording what they see. The notion of replicability has always been seen as a key feature of science. and other disciplines as well. And yet in the last couple of years, there have been some really interesting experiments based on a network-based kind of analysis that looked at 100 classic sociological or psychological or other experiments and discovered that they could only replicate, I think it was like 60% of them. So what does that mean that those disciplines are worthless? No, it doesn't. But it does mean that we as practitioners of whatever discipline have to be more responsible and more aware of the limitations of what we can and cannot say based on whatever it is we observe or the kind of experiment that we do or this, the population that we're sampling and decisions that we're making there. And I think from there, you can then extend that in terms of other ways that science writ broadly plays out, say, within the realm of what we could now call indigenous science, or again, other ways of knowing the world.
Yes. Yeah. Oh, yes, you.
Yeah, thanks. I'm Marjorie Fee and I'm from English. And just as a point of information, although you may all know this, there is a Science and Technology Studies program at UBC where these same questions, obviously not so Indigenous focused, are discussed. So I just recommend their seminar series to you if you're interested in the topic. So I've been working on polar bears lately and Indigenous, Inuit mainly, but not solely, ways of dealing, thinking about polar bears. And there's a big argument between scientists and Indigenous people about polar bears. Scientists saying they're declining or stable, and Indigenous people, mainly Inuit, saying, no, there's way more. There's too many. they're more than usual. And the scientists are saying that's because they've been forced off the ice by climate change. So there's this quite serious clash going on between, say, Nunavut and Northwest Territories, where most of the polar bears are hanging out, and the scientists, the polar bear scientists. So it's an interesting problem. But I guess my answer to the question is not to try to prove who's right, because that's a Western science reaction, right? Is to say, well, one of them must be right, let's just go out there and do more Western science to prove the Inuit are either right or wrong. But the thing I got from what Julie said, I was thinking about that grease in the pan. And one thing that the Inuit say is you must never speak negatively about a polar bear. You must never gossip about a polar bear, because stuff will happen, things will be bad for you. And I was thinking that what is the knowledge for is interesting. So the knowledge about that don't fry grease on a glacier is not only to keep you from frying grease on a glacier, but to think about what you're doing and seeing and the kind of analogies you're making. So you cannot even make a disrespectful analogy if you're going to follow the teachings, right? And so I think there's just a kind of a disconnect between what the knowledge is for, as well as what it is. So I guess I'm just asking you to comment on that momentary insight, if it is one.
Well, one comment I would make is, I think that's the way you framed it is the same way almost all the stories that I've heard. Usually it's someone going along in life, a young person usually, because young people never tell what they'll do, and there's an infraction. And in order to have that infraction dealt with, quite often that young person is led away by the person who feels damaged, or the being feels damaged, and then comes back, is able to spend a long time and then come back with new knowledge. And I think it's rather similar with the glaciers too. You wouldn't shout loudly, but the glacier is alive. It is, in these stories, glacier pays attention. And so I think that, I guess I'm thinking oral tradition is so different from science in that way, but I do think that the relationship part is so important for all of these experiments that I've heard. Yeah, you don't mess around with glaciers, and you don't. But it's the same as with animals. You know, the larger thing, you can say, and I know this doesn't sound the least bit scientific, but it's a very good way to think about how we live in the world. We're talking about this now with climate change. I just think that, these are, everybody's responsible in some way or another for the way things go, because it happen, and that's certainly the message that I took from what I heard from these women, that was the message they were giving.
Yeah, and your question also reminded me of the important distinction between information and knowledge. The information is observations of data, is whatever, but knowledge is information put to use in some fashion. And so when we're talking about indigenous knowledge, or traditional ecological knowledge, whatever, we're looking at how generations of information gathering has been enfolded into behavior and lifeways and foodways and all the things that people actually do, including respect for holiness.
I wondered before you had a question, Elsie, do you want to speak to the STS program?
Well, yeah, exactly. Yeah, we advertised the STS this session. And I think of STS at its best, history, philosophy, sociology, anthropology, and science, as doing exactly this job of showing how situated scientific knowledge is. And what you were emphasizing is the dynamism of scientific knowledge. And there's a replication crisis, and I think the numbers are actually way worse than what you were quoting. It's 40% replicability in social psych in some areas. And that can be seen as evidence of the robustness of the practice, that it could be criticized in that way and corrected and so on. But what that means is that the soundbite version of this is the truth, science has proven X, is a non-starter, even within the tradition, narrowly defined as Western science. So yeah, I think one way, the question about how you could cultivate, displace the reification of science as a thing. There's a lot of resource in history of science, just straight up history of mainstream science that shows how dramatically different sciences have evolved, and then the comparative work that shows how different subfields are even within a given field, what the norms of practice and justification are. They're highly variable, highly specific, and they evolve with the science and as purposes shift. So yeah, we've got a really big task to get the word out there. It's not every time there's a critique or a replication crisis, it shouldn't be a counsel of despair. It should be a reset to recognize the, in some ways, fragile but also dynamic nature of sciences in the plural.
I mean, I think that's a great point, and it also speaks to this notion of science is not all about finding the truth. Science is about coming up with explanations, and explanation and truth are two very, very different things. And also in terms of your comment, Allison, I would also say that the failure to replicate certain experiments is actually proof that science works. That this is a valuable process that we're not trying to toss out, but we are trying to make it work better by identifying bias, as Heather points out, or by pointing out that you just can't do an experiment once and publish it in Science, and everyone says, okay, we've solved that problem, let's move on. I mean, the world is complicated, and whether we're talking about Gloscap, the transformer, Mi'kmaq territory, going around and transforming, the world, and finding a correlation between stories about where he did things and good lithic sources, as some archaeologists have identified, or the other end of the scale, delving into quantum mechanics and the voodoo that goes on there in terms of multiple ways of explaining the world at the subatomic level, which is not all that different from how indigenous peoples may call on other than human beings to explain things about the world. So there's some really interesting dynamics and tensions that go on in the world that we're discussing now. And it's up to this upcoming generation to solve these problems.
Add it to my to-do list.
We're in good hands.
You'll just get right on that. When you say that it's explanation, that you focus on explanation, I would add to that explanation is always situated in pragmatic. Right? It's always an answer to some question. And so a crucial part of science education, I think, should be to consistently recover what the questions were to which specific methods and protocols were developed as a way of response. And what you'll find is that they're very situated, right? And the effectiveness of the science, to the extent it is key to that pragmatism. Right? I mean, the idea that the laws of physics lie is the title of a sort of famous philosophy of physics colleague's book. And it's really all about the fact that the overarching, highly idealized, universalized laws, even in physics, are not useful in their own right. They're all indexed to particular application. And there's vast infrastructure to make them work. So the pragmatism can be seen even in some of the most abstract canonical science. Anyway, and then you situate all of that bundle, those what were the questions? Who's asking? Why are they asking? What for? And they're all situated in an industrial revolution, colonial, imperialist, political context.
If I could add to that, like it's also, it's not just like explanation and what you're saying, like the pragmatism, but it's also interpretation. So how the science is interpreted to answer those questions, because you could choose to interpret it in one way that would either stand in opposition to what Indigenous knowledge is espousing, or it could stand in alongside Indigenous knowledge and what it's espousing. Because even with I'm just thinking about the polar bear example, I couldn't look behind. Was it too high? So even like with the polar bear example, right? Those two explanations didn't have to be mutually exclusive, right? Because you could say, yes, of course, there's more polar bears, you can see them because there's less ice, and this is where they're going. So you can interpret the data to satisfy the Indigenous knowledge. They don't have to stand in opposition. So it's how all that data is interpreted and presented to, and what I think should stand beside traditional knowledge if that's what the goal of that question is.
Well, it's interesting you mentioned that, because I think of media representation and you know what I'm trying to say.
Yeah.
The way the media presents and they sensationalize these scientific findings or the great big archaeological discoveries. And I think that people who don't sit around and think about these or come to these seminars for fun, they highlight this. The media presents the findings as truth, and it's this scientific authority that is just constantly reproduced through practice and through high school science classes. And I think that the way that you've criticized science in your comments is really lovely too. That they're forgetting that their science is biased, right? They're forgetting to include that in their methodology. Caroline.
Yeah, my name is Daniela. I'm new to the constituency and I thought I wouldn't say anything, but the discussion is so interesting. And I'm speaking as a medievalist and as a mythologist. One of the things that fascinates me is that science is our myth, is the myth we're living in. And to the point of not being aware anymore of the fact that it is our myth. And we're lived by the myth. As every mythologist should know, the myth lives us, we're not living the myth. So perhaps what we should do in order to come closer to the Indigenous perspective is just recover the remembering of this. And for someone like me who is a medievalist or a mythologist, is sort of embedded in my worldview that if we can scrape this myth, well, we will see that there is a whole layer of other myths that have informed also the Western culture. And just being able to get slightly in touch with this, I see this with my students. The moment you get in touch with that other level of Western myth, it's like opening an entire new perspective, and the dialogue becomes completely rejuvenated by that.
You know, I find the term myth, you know, a loaded term, one we have to be very, very careful about, because it often is seen as dismissive of the reality of the information or the stories that are embedded within it. And I also would like to point out that, you know, in archaeology, you know, we are interpreting people's lives and what they did 5,000, 50,000, a million years ago. But ultimately it comes down to we are simply telling stories, you know, informed by science or archaeology or whatever. And we hope we get it right. We think, you know, we're often pretty close. But at the same time, even archaeologists don't necessarily agree with interpretations. And that's why we have our own myths. You know, the myth of the Maya collapse, the myth of the Chaco dispersion, and so on. And, you know, that is often not acknowledged as much as it should be.
Just to speak in favor of the notion of myth. Is there not a way in which, the way I used to understand myth is kind of eternal truth, rather than scientific truth, but a truth that sort of goes through layers and layers. I'm sure that if people, the women I work with were using, they don't use that word of course, but it's these eternal stories that they want to have passed on. So I think there's a problem with us taking myth as a kind of, you're right, and that's people do sometimes.
I think a knee-jerk reaction, like the people who were so offended by your article, right, is a practitioner of science who's not open-minded to hear you call science our mythology. That knee-jerk reaction stems from their belief that other worldviews have, like are impossible. Like you can't hold two things simultaneously. And I would find it ironic if a scientist were like hurt by calling their science a myth, because I mean it's almost a pejorative to a scientist, I imagine. Scientists want to speak about that?
I thought it was true. I agree. Well, I guess.
Sorry, that would imply that all of the ways in which other people through the millennia have seen the world were not good enough.
Yeah.
So just by having the humility to embrace the possibility that this is our myth or our dream, I think we're just entering a different space in which conversation becomes possible, rather than having this colonizing worldview in which science cannot be disputed as kind of broken.
Well, acknowledging science as a myth would have to validate all of the other myths.
Exactly.
This is just an observation. And Heather, you were talking about science as a method, right? There's this method at the core of it, but what I think we're talking about and imagining as Western science here was deeply, part of modernity, right, and the Enlightenment, and that was, at least coming out of the Western tradition, that was a period of the decline of mysticism, the end of God, and the rise of this. So it's a method, but it's also a method to inquire into a universe that is ruled, governed, devoid of mysticism, in which, gods and other, entities don't exist, but it's a method to inquire into a knowable, ruled, governed universe that's been completely demystified. So as I said, this is just an observation. I think it sort of touching on this, how weird it might seem for many to think of science as a myth, because it was to replace, it was to replace religious worldviews and
This is why I go back to interpretation, because it's like, there are lots of things that science don't know, and it's like we try to make, with some things that don't necessarily seem to have a logical flow, like this, this might be the correlation to this, output that we see, but we don't necessarily know the cause or know how these things are connected, so we try to think of the best or the easiest answer, and that is a story that we tell ourselves. That is an interpretation of what we think is happening, and that's totally mythos. Like it's absolutely mythos, right? Because we don't really know, and we're trying to make our best, most logical assumption, and maybe that is the mystery. The mystery is like how do these things actually connect in so fundamental and seemingly detached ways, and yet things are connected, and it's your perception of, like when we talk about, sometimes when I talk about human evolution, I talk about like Christian scientists and stuff. It's like where you can still hold this sort of sense of awe for what's happening, even though you kind of sort of know the process that's happening, but still there's still sort of a mystery and an awe around it. So it doesn't sort of lose its divinity kind of thing. But at the same time, it's like we have to make some connections that may or may not hold true, and that's mythos.
There's a very interesting example from late classical Greece. So, myth figures prominently in interpretations of the world and people's behavior and what they should emulate in terms of the gods and so on. And at the same time, there is astounding science that's going on at the same time, including the anthropological mechanism that is the world's first analog computer, based with 60 or 50 gears, and it's an astounding piece of machinery. So you have this, different view of the world, and at the same time, it's also a science, or at least partially based science, understanding of that world.
We have about 10 minutes before we wrap up. Chat to that. Maybe 2 more questions I think perhaps.
I guess I would just make a comment as a producer of scientific data. And I feel a little bit, I feel often I'm referred to as a scientist, and it's in a way that is almost offensive, like I don't understand that I have biases and that I see the world in black and white, which is obviously not true. And I guess what I would say is that as a producer of scientific data, and a lot of my colleagues that I've worked with in many different scientific disciplines, we're not automatons who wander around believing that what we are producing is truth. I mean, we know we have biases, we investigate them as much as we can. We are aware that we can interpret our data in multiple ways. We test our assumptions as much as we can, and I accept that what we produce as truth or explanations is only as good as the method we use, the question we ask, the data that's able to come out of that, the sample size. But I guess we also accept that if we didn't try to test these hypotheses, we would basically be at a standstill. As Heather says, we're using the method in the best way that we can. So I'm not really sure that, yes, we create this dichotomy, but I'm not sure it's as huge as we think it is. It's not so insurmountable as we think it is, because I think as, quote, scientists, we are open and accepting of our limitations and biases, and that good scientists embrace that. It's just a thought.
Yeah, I mean, immediately we get into the stereotype of the ignorant scientist, and then you realize, wait a minute, that's stupid. There's the good scientist and the bad scientist.
Well, I don't know if it's good or bad.
Well, I invite you all to do what I did, which was read rather loosely, I guess, hundreds of scientific articles, just looking at the abstract, not deeply reading it. And there's sort of a machine, that generates papers, that generates a lot of papers that they're not evil, but they're another little node on a cathedral. I've just done my little bit. And I think that's the part of science that worries me, that there's the small, useful possibly even bit. But somehow there's the idea of where that bit fits in a larger structure isn't always part of science, and it doesn't seem to be part of these papers. So I was looking at the use of race in medical studies. And they start with black people, or they start with Chinese people, or, and you just go, well, wait a minute here, what do you mean by black? But, that question is already over here somewhere.
Yeah.
So those are the problems, I think, that science and technology studies is trying to deal with in a nuanced way. I mean, it's not just scientists slamming. I used to use anthropologist in the same way. You say anthropologist, blah. We come out of our own disciplines quite ignorant, and we have to learn other disciplines have a human center.
Just going to respond, Camilla, sorry. I think certainly from my perspective, it's not the good scientists that are the problem, right? It's the people who are not, it's the scientists who are not open to their biases, right? So if everybody was a good science, we wouldn't be having these discussions, right? Because everybody would be open to the fact that we don't actually know anything. Also, as a producer of science, right? That just understanding that this is a small portion of what we know, to the point where it no longer fits our hypotheses, right? And we know that. We as good scientists know that. But it's when, again, like if it's taken in the media and not represented in the way that it was intended to, or if it's used inappropriately by again, somebody who's not privy to the philosophy of the scientific method, right? That's when it becomes a problem.
I was just going to say that I think that, like for instance, the reviews that you have on the Smithsonian, I mean, we can't really have this conversation without considering the extraordinarily polarized political moment that we all find ourselves in, where you have anti-vaxxers, like people who are against vaccinations, you have people that don't believe in climate change. You actually have a very active, very politically visible anti-knowledge movement in the world right now, and that pushes everyone, including scientists, to take these hard positions where anything that is outside of this idea of science with a capital S, gets pushed against. And unfortunately, people that are outside of the conversation about like traditional ways of knowing or indigenous knowledge see something that is outside of, quote, science with that capital S and push against it as if they would, because it has to be truth, right? You have to present it where you can get people to get their kids to get vaccinated, or you can start getting conversations about getting funding to work with indigenous communities on climate change, that sort of thing. So I just think that that's something that should be considered when we're talking about positionality that science is taking and scientists take in this discussion in public. So that was just my thought.
I mean, I fully agree.
Well, I guess I think that there is each person who's engaged in doing research in an academic context is doing their best and really trying to be aware of all of the potential pitfalls and also aware, because it's a creative process and you're aware of the ways in which you have to come up with an idea, investigate that question, explore possible explanations, and I don't think anyone ever thinks that they're inventing the truth when they're doing that. Even people who you might later say are doing bad science. But I think that for all of us that are working within these academic institutions, which are inevitably informed by colonial histories and presence, we do need to be aware in these other ways about how we are constructing a story together. And sometimes that is, there's an external discourse and public discourse about science, which we don't necessarily relate to that as what we're doing, but we also want to be aware of how it creates a perception of what we're doing in different contexts. And I think it's really helpful, hopefully, for this kind of a dialogue to be happening within the university, so that people can start to embrace and think about what research is in a much broader way. Research has been going on in indigenous territories, in indigenous communities
forever. And it is an example of scientific method exactly as much as any other scientific method in any other context. In many cases, it's more connected to spiritual realities as well. It allows people to be more connected to other kinds of relationships that they have as human beings in the world with other beings. But I think that it's helpful to just broaden our idea about what research is, and to broaden our idea about what science is. And I appreciate, I'm grateful to this cluster for promoting that kind of a conversation. So that's not a question. That's a comment.
The linguistic.
Somebody else? I'm just curious, going way back to the very beginning, we talked a bit about biographies, and Karen talked about a empirical thing, something rather new, and George.
I know now what it means.
Yes. George is a sort of sexual archaeologist, perhaps, in archaeology. Now finding yourself in Kamloops, working within and for Indigenous communities. That you have a parallel story. What was that transition about between ways of seeing knowledge production?
I mean, it was a humbling experience in the sense of, realizing, actually, here's a story that really galvanized things for me. And I think some of you have heard this before. So I was teaching a course, and a student came in, a native student, to say, I couldn't get my term paper done. And I asked why, expecting the usual litany of, with my boyfriend or whatever it was, and she said I couldn't get my term paper done because my spirit helper left me. And my first reaction was to myself, that's one I haven't heard before. And then that lightning bolt of anthropological understanding hit me and said, yeah, here is a person from a different culture who looks just like me and speaks English and so on. And yet she's just revealed to me something that is essential to her worldview. And I think that was one of the most formative moments of my professional career, of not only having studied anthropology forever in the abstract, but here coming face to face with the reality of me having to accept or not that explanation. And I thought that was, so important to me.
Well, I think for me, the turn, it would have happened while I was formulating the research question for my undergrad thesis. And my original thought was that I was going to look at people's surface collections and do some sort of metric analysis and statistically correlate them with time components. And while researching, I was like, well, I'm looking at this Western yardstick to measure the significance for an Indigenous community, and I'm like, I've got this all wrong. Like, I need to, I thought that I was recentering ideas, but I just wanted to displace or decenter those, like the assumptions, the attachment to context as a thing that we've created and made real, to like uplift the significance for the community. So like for me, I realized that I was coming about it in the wrong way. And now, like moving forward, I just constantly re-examine my questions. Like whose yardstick am I trying to measure with here? And what is a yard?
I guess I've taken a lot of different formative moments, and certainly I did an undergraduate degree in anthropology, and then I was in the Yukon, and that was amazing, and I stayed there for 15 years, and then I came back as a very mature student to study anthropology again, and I think that was very interesting for me, because as an undergraduate, you do sort of learn these things, and you learn things by names of words, kinship and so on, all these kinds of things you take in anthropology courses. And it was really, the Yukon was a tremendously important experience in terms of my thinking about these things from different ways, and then coming back and finding that anthropology had actually changed from the 1960s.
Well, on that note, it's 2:30, so I think we'll break from the formal element, and there's snacks in the back, and we have those rooms for lots of women. But please, join me in thanking our